Bill Henshaw here, Constitutional Crisis Channel. Been a little bit later than I'd like getting on some new videos, but you're going to love the ones we're doing today. So first we're going to start with current events in New Orleans, and probably a lot of you have read about this. I mean, this is an ongoing attack on the Confederate States of America and the real reasons for the war between the states, which had little to do with slavery, as you'll hear later on in the video. But that was a pretext. The context was much different. But now here they are trying to take down some more statues. At least they're not destroying them. Although that's been suggested by one Malcolm Subaru. I'd like to talk to this guy who said he'd be just as happy if the authorities passed out sledgehammers and let people have a whack at these things. That's entirely wrong, given the fact that these were patriots and they were doing the right thing. And indeed, there's just one of these statues was directed to those who fought valiantly against the Reconstruction government in New Orleans in the 1870s. Now, when you understand that that was a government that consisted of federal, regional, martial law rule, with no judicial courts, no rights for anybody, and no nothing except for the fat cats at 120 Broadway, New York, you begin to get an idea of just how seriously misconstrued history is in this area, and for good reason. And don't feel bad, they didn't teach me 50 years ago either. I found all this out on my own. You know, all we ever heard about this time was the infamous Dred Scott case. I'll talk more about that later. And the fact that Andrew Johnson was the first president who was impeached. They never told us why. If I had learned that 50 years ago, my life might well have been quite different than what it's turned out to be. Much better, much earlier. But that's not what they wanted me to know. It's not what they want you to know either. Because the keys to the freedom are held here, and this is why I openly and notoriously advocate quote-unquote white supremacist issues, because if we can't go in there and assert our creator-endowed inalienable rights, how in the world can anyone else do it? Where is the equal protection there? If we don't have it, you can't get it. Simple. So here we are again in the midst of this BS down there in New Orleans. It's just going to go on and on until they get rid of all the statutes and everything had to do with the war between the states. And that's a shame because of how important it is, along with earlier episodes in history, including the nullification crisis in South Carolina in the 1830s. We'll be talking about that on a separate video. And you'll see what's going on there and why they don't want you to know any of this. Because then you start thinking along terms of states' rights. Now the next logical step is thinking of the federated republican form of government that we're supposed to have. Where the hell did it go? Without states, there's unlimited federal jurisdiction. And those of you that may have occasion to come across my appellate packet that includes a 50-page brief on admission of new states that's never been opposed, there's quite a lot said in there on this subject matter. So it's not just me saying it, or as they're fond of saying here in the California courts, my interpretation of the law, and yet I'm sitting there with that 50-page brief, 24 pages on concurrent jurisdiction, 17 pages on status and standing, not to mention 584 jury instructions. That's hardly my interpretation now, is it? This is the truth that they don't want you to know, and the very truth I'm trying to get out there, because the more of us that use this and go into courts, the quicker we're going to get these issues resolved. And none of you has to take near the chances that I've taken over the course of the last decade in particular. And don't have to be worried about being thrown in jail far away from home like I was, alone in a jail cell. And I still kicked their ass all the way to the State House from there. You won't have to worry about that, because when you put these documents in, you're not going to know them as well as I do. I got that. You won't have to. Because anybody that reads them that has a modicum of understanding from their law school days is going to realize you talk to somebody who knows what the hell the law is. And they can't afford to take any chances on having issues like this going into the higher courts and running into a judge who happens to believe in his oath of office and knows the history of the country and is going to rule in our favor. Because those kind of rulings get into the books and they become binding precedent. That's the power we have here, even going into the traffic court. But my issues are good, as I've said, in a much broader scope than just the traffic court. Just about any criminal case you can think of for openers. And lots of other good things we'll be talking about in other videos. But this is why this crap in New Orleans and other places, and when they took down the Stars and Bars in Columbia, South Carolina, which is where I sat there in jail for 5 months, these are the kind of things you need to be aware of and the real significance of it. And those of you that are, for example, blacks or Asians or gays or drag queens or whatever, and you're trying to assert rights under the quote-unquote Civil Rights Act, forget about it. You don't have any. The only time that wins is on the rare occasion they have to make it look good. And that continues, their good appearance in office like they're doing their job, makes a lot of attorneys rich for collecting money that they probably shouldn't be getting, and they're invoking jurisdiction that doesn't exist. You follow my program and you start to get onto all these things, the light's going to come on just like it did for me. And I'm a little embarrassed, by the way, to tell you it took as long as it did for me, but through the course of my studies over 4 decades, finally one day that came on and I said, I'll be damned. Well, that's the point I want to get you to, because once that happens, you'll know how important it is not only for yourself and your family, but your posterity to be able to go into courts and assert their rights and keep government off our backs. Now, I've gotten a little fear with this video, I admit, but this is the full significance of what's going on in New Orleans and across the South, with the current exception, by the way, the state of Mississippi. Which brings me to the next subject. They had a representative there out of the Mississippi Assembly named Carl Oliver, I believe, that was quoted as saying that he thought that the politicians in New Orleans ought to be lynched for doing what they were doing and destroying history, much like what occurred in Nazi Germany, which is a hell of a good analogy of that situation. Now, I'm not so sure I would have used the word lynched, and indeed Oliver was forced to apologize, especially for the use of that word. But in pure point of fact, he has some good points to make, and I expect I'll be communicating with him and see how much he really understands about this. But then no sooner he does this, and you get all these blacks and jumping up and down on the civil rights site demanding an apology, because he's offended their civil rights. And he's done no such thing. They simply don't understand. They've been sold out by their own leadership, who's riding their backs to stay in power and get the money and stuff that they have that enables them to have a good lifestyle while keeping their own people downtrodden. That's the bottom line with civil rights associations, even the ones you might have a few of the leaders acting in good faith. But trust me, the majority of the higher-ups know better. And that's where they should be called to account for it. And those of you that belong to those organizations might want to start doing that. And very soon I'm going to put together a packet of documents that you can get at a reasonable price that you send to your local civil rights organization and say, hey, what the hell are you people doing here? And why should I continue to support your efforts anymore when they're in clear violation of the Constitution of the United States? That's when things are going to start to change, especially if we all pull together, because we have a lot more in the way of common interests here than you can imagine if you're first starting out here. Like I say, it's going to dawn on you. It's part of my job to help make that happen, so that a lot of people start thinking the right way about the Constitution and history of the United States. That's the way we make changes. And like I said, I have a lot more to say about that on future videos, and I invite you to watch them. Now, continuing this video on the events in New Orleans, I should have made a couple of notes here about some of the real causes of the Civil War, or the war between the states. And really, it was never about racism, never about slavery, only a very limited extent. The real issues there were our federated republican form of government, and the fact that the territories were held in trust by the United States for the benefit of all of the people of the United States. Not just those north of the Mason-Dixon line, not just those in the immediate environs of 120 Broadway, New York, for everybody. And it was thought, by the way, that that's what was supposed to be happening, and you could go, for example, from a southern state where slavery was perfectly legal, right or wrong or good or bad, into a territory, if you so desired, if you had opportunities there, to engage in activities that would increase your family's wealth and enable you better to take care of your family, and maybe even move the family into a territory, for example. The perfectly good right to do that with the right to travel. There's no question about it. And I will note here, when I talk about the slave states, quote unquote, if we didn't come in that way in the South, and I say we because I'm from the vestiges of the old South, and I'm not embarrassed to say that, there would have been no United States. For right or wrong, or good or bad, that's the great compromise that was made in 1787, and that's what people had to live with, because otherwise it doesn't exist. But in pure point of fact, the issue with the territories was that it was also thought by those in the North, or quite a few of them, that there were very few limits on the powers of Congress in territories. Now, there's quite a distinction, and you read Supreme Court decisions, and you're going to be, when we talk more about individual cases in this area that I call state versus territory, that there were clear distinctions between states and territories. States were much more freer to do what they wanted within their boundaries and within their constitutions, and only if they violated the provision of the Constitution from 1787 to 1791 does that become a federal case. So it wasn't a perfect system then. It won't be now if we restore it, but it will be one hell of a lot better. So that was what was going on. And the other thing in the South, too, keep in mind that we're agrarian in the South. It was commercial up north and industrial. And therefore, we had to make do with what we could grow on the lands for the most part, whether that was, cotton, food, what have you, and be able to sell that to producers, especially those in the North. And earlier times, the South also had markets in France and England. That's what set the nullification crisis off in 1830. And as much as I like Andrew Jackson, I disagree with him on this one. Because the South was right. Because what happened was that the North had gotten enough control in Congress, they were able to pass laws and alter the taxes in imports and exports to the extent that it effectively put France and England out of the market in bidding for Southern raw goods and forcing the South to sell them to the North at whatever price they could. And if that wasn't bad enough, then the money that came into the federal coffers was being spent disproportionately in states north of the Mason-Dixon line. So I'm not going to go into a real primer on the crisis right now, but that's kind of the basics of what were going on then. And you had some vestiges of that even with the war between the states 30 years later, because the situation hadn't changed markedly in that time frame. We hadn't had the Industrial Revolution yet. So you can see this is the course of some serious issues that went on that only modestly touched the issue of slavery. And that's what was going on. So it's important to understand that slavery was a context. It just happened to exist, but the real issue was in the Constitution, under what powers the government had and how they could exercise them. And a final note before I go, I'm going to be doing a series on what are called insular case decisions that involve places like Puerto Rico, the Philippines, that were not designed to become states and couldn't become states, at least at the time they were annexed into the United States. And in insular territories, Congress has a hell of a lot more power than it does in territories that would ultimately become states. That's a very big difference. I'll be talking more about that. But my final note is that, trust me, from what I've read and what I've studied and the case decisions I've read, it looks like that the Supreme Court and other courts think, albeit sub silentio, without telling you about it, that we really are in insular territories. It's going to be shocking when I read you some of these insular cases from 120 years ago, but it's going to seem real familiar at the same time. Trust me, I can show you how that's going to happen when those videos come. Thank you.